Buongiorno. È tutto per...
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our meeting entitled Afghanistan, Is Everything Been Lost? In the last couple of weeks, we have been shocked by the terrible images that have come to us in the last in a war that has been dear to us in the last 20 years. We wanted to start this dialogue, to start asking questions, and especially the question, is everything lost in Afghanistan? And we would also like to recall the encounter we had here with Rula Ghani, the Afghan president, who was, of course, president up until 2 weeks ago. She spoke here at the meeting in 2015. It was a really important moment for us. It was a time when Afghanistan still dreamed of a better future, and thousands of people tried to create a new society for their country. Let's listen to what she had to say in 2015. War is a terrible thing. Not only does it bring down buildings and obliterate cities, not only does it kill and maim people, war, especially a prolonged civil war, destroys the very social fabric of a community, its norms, its customs, its beliefs, its sense of right and wrong. War is barbaric. War turns human beings into immoral monsters. War allows for the committing of atrocities. War glorifies the absurd and the senseless. War is when people lose their humanity. Our commitment to the people of Afghanistan is to try and find a way to rebuild the fabric of our society. We need to reclaim our history, our traditions, our beliefs, our values. We need to remember that we have a beautiful country and that we should all unite to rebuild it. We need to stand up against violence and refuse to be bullied. We need to remember that life was good for everyone under the rule of law. We need to remember that we are all human beings, and that as such, we should respect each other and live in harmony. May God help us on our journey. The Afghanistan of which this First Lady spoke about Rouhani ended on the 16th of August 2021 with the proclamation of the new Arab Emirate. The news tried to chase the new events happening, but it's important to understand how this event begins within the Afghanistan that was trying to rebuild the foundations of its government. Of course, we have we remember what happened at 9/11, and we have the anniversary coming up soon, where 3,000 Americans were killed. And America, the United States, decide to arm themselves and begin a war in Afghanistan as a result, because in order to contrast the terrorism that was at the root of the attack, they try to in front of the no of the terrorists in Afghanistan, there was an attack, an official military attack declared on Afghanistan. In 2003, this became a new operation called Enduring Freedom. This was the great moment in which, a couple of years later, then Rouhani spoke here at the meeting. During these 20 years, this military protection, 54 Italian soldiers died during this time, but it helped many people to rebuild Afghanistan between NGOs, allowing humanitarian projects. And we see the traces of all this in these days because many Afghans have tried to contribute and to help in all these endeavors. Some of them have tried to escape by walking, others by plane, and they have been doing incredible things to try and save themselves, escape from this situation insofar as they are collaborators of the Western world. We all are living a sense of great tragedy in front of these images. And we are trying to look at these images with the urgency to find answers. It is important to go deep in these questions, however, even though we might not find the answers yet. We should try and consider and highlight certain aspects of these questions. To talk about this, we have Fernando de Haro, a Spanish journalist who has spent a lot of time in the Middle East, has traveled widely, and he has tried to find Christians and help persecuted Christians in the Middle East. He also has worked in Pakistan, and we'll see how Pakistan is tied to Afghanistan's recent history. And we will also talk to a speaker who has very often spoken with us here at the meeting of Rimini, Wael Farouq, a professor of language and Arab literature at the University of Milan, the Sacred Heart. He has introduced us to a new knowledge, a new understanding of the Islamic world and Arab culture. I wanted to offer Fernando a first point of reflection. We have all talked about a sense of tragedy the sense of 20 years completely thrown away, and many lost lives, many Afghan lives as well. There are many Afghan lives within the Afghan army that the American soldiers tried to bring up as an army. Many civilians have died. Huge efforts to try and build and rebuild this society. And we have seen Afghanistan. We know Afghanistan through the stories of during the time of the Soviet invasion. And we met journalists who were witnesses of that invasion, which had been the end of a long series of coups d'etat and small revolutions. And it's a war that has been going on for a long time. Has democracy finished? Is this a defeat for democracy? Our democracies, the values that we have tried to bring, to Afghanistan through this enduring freedom operation? Thank you for your question. I have to say that I'm not a specialist in this, but what I can talk about is my experience as someone who has traveled around the Middle East. And I'm a Westerner. I have the experience as a Westerner, and I am looking at what's happening right now with my personal experience at hand. Is this a defeat of democracy? Well, we tried to bring democracy. We tried to do all of this, bring this project. We have this image. We have this terrible situation, the images of the Kabul airport. I remember a conversation I had in Egypt on the River Nile at around 10 p.m. and I had come back after the fall of the Muslim Brothers government. And I was there with a friend. I had a very interesting conversation. When will democracy arrive here in Egypt? And I had this question, when? When will it come? And he said, you Westerners, you often have too much hurry. You want things to happen too quickly. You think 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. I was quite interested to read an article by Sabino Cassese, who said, democracy is a universal right. And he recalled what was said during the UN meeting in the 2005. This seems like something abstract, though. Democracy is a human right. This is an abstraction in a certain way. We saw women talk about the value of life, but these human rights as universal. Is an abstract universal? We don't understand that this actually needs to be made concrete in history. We went to Afghanistan. We made great efforts. And how is it possible that democracy still wasn't able to affirm itself? Well, we could conclude that democracy isn't something that we can build in a couple of years. What happened effectively in Afghanistan? The United States and the Western world has made great efforts of generosity. But what can we say about all this? What are the results? We haven't won the war, but we have also lost peace. The efforts the U.S. didn't facilitate integration between the humanitarian aids there and the Afghan people. We need a subject that is able to make the transformation real. There isn't democracy. Democracy can't exist where there is no subject, there is no I. Even if no matter how much time you put into it, but a person needs time. I would like to, as Panzramisa said, we think that democracy is like a process. It's something automatic, something easy. But how many times have we needed to come together as a continent, as Europe, to create democracy? It's a question of culture, and values don't exist in and of themselves. This is a provocation for us too, because we should be quite careful. This is Afghanistan we're talking about, of course, but is this what our democracy is founded on? Maybe an I, the subject, is missing, the person. We are scandalized by the fact that there's no democracy, but the subject, the person, needs time in order to mature, to become, to grow. I wanted to talk about the structure of religious ideology. This is exactly what I wanted to start talking about, because Afghanistan has now become an Arab emirate. There won't be any democracy because our state is founded upon the Sharia. This is so. In order to understand all this, we shouldn't consider it as opposite, as simply as opposite of the Western world, but we should. Many friends have asked me, why are many people so silent about what's happening in the Middle East? No, it's not that they're silent. They're completely overwhelmed. This is why we don't hear much from them. The revolt of Mujahideen in the 1970s caused a great destabilization and terrorism within the country. And we lived all this during the 80s. So all the governments, all the religious leaders of the Islamic world are worried, are alarmed, and have said more than once that this ideology does not have anything to do with Islam. And a couple of years ago, we had a Muslim guest who condemned what was happening in the Taliban. So what is the deepest problem within the ideology of the Taliban? And I would go backwards to 2006, when Maulawi Hibatullah, in his reception speech, in his acceptance speech, made a promise to make Islam go back to its purest form. And this word pure is a key word in order to understand the problem of religious ideology. When purity is at the center of a religious experience, the most important thing are rules. And when rules are no longer an instrument but a sacred aim, all of this chaos happens. When religiosity is governed by a schema, by a mechanism, it no longer becomes a meaning that responds to a present, to reality. And when purity is at the center, people live in the fear of falling into sin rather than trying to discover beauty. And in order to maintain this purity, we need to enforce a rule. We need Sharia law. But the rules of the Taliban are not the same as the Islamic rules. In the Quran, 1 out of 6,000 verses, there are only some of them that talk about the Sharia. In order to defend purity, and purity is the aim, violence is also justified, violence against others. So this is the problem that makes me think that the Taliban will never change. Because as long as human rights and democracy are there, they will completely nullify them. Because another important element to consider is also the fact that they have no type of organization, no administrative structure. They believe in an idea, in this closed scheme, and they justify by accepting the calling of the jihad. And if they try to change, they can't impose this because they can't impose this on their followers because the followers are part of a body. But these followers follow the Sharia individually. The Sharia law is like a metaphor. In Arabic, it means the road in a desert. It is the road made by the traces of those who have made a walk of faith. So this concept of Sharia law is not the concept that the Taliban propose. It is an ideology and makes the others look like an enemy. What is this version of the Sharia law and Taliban ideology? What is the link between this and terrorism that we have seen, that we have lived also in our world, and that which we have identified as maybe in a superficial way, but we identify as ISIS? We probably give it a name which is a generalization. It's much more complex. They are often probably they're against each other as well and have internal wars and battles. And the idea of the caliphate, are they all the same or are there differences between them? Yes, there are differences, but they're not marginal. I could say that the Muslim Brothers are also included within this group, so the differences between them are quite marginal. I would say that the problem is not only violence, but the main problem is to transform religion into a religious ideology, into a politics. All of this violence is not based on something that the Quran says, but how are they interpreted? In what context are they? They are only interpreted based on a political form of Islam. And Islam, Jamaluddin was an Afghan thinker of Muslim, and he contrasted this. Their point of departure is ideology, religion, and which is the worst ideology that man could embrace. This ideology, Fernando, seems to have survived for a long time, but not only this, has also seemed to have defeated our all the good things that we tried to bring in the West from the Western world. It's an ideology. All of our efforts were completely abandoned in a very brief time, and this ideology has come to win over all of this again. This fragility, which did not allow this to flourish because there was no I involved. There was no subject. Or Andrea Pulito on Corriere della Sera said, the only thing that we can say is try to help refugees, at least to not be hypocritical, to help them to maintain the promises. This is the only thing we can do. Why are we so fragile? Why has democracy was not able to convince Afghanistan and convince ourselves to challenge this ideology at the root?
So I think there's two factors. An anthropological one, that is one of what we've been talking about, the lack of this I. You can't think that democracy can develop without kind of the building of these foundations. This is a very important question because for about 200 years we've been thinking that we've conquered the democratic process, and that this process is the same for everyone and it will be the same forever. And exactly, this subject is always a historical one. We always think in the abstract sense. Without history, we reach democracy, and for us, therefore, since we have it, everyone should have it. And this is a weakness of experience, of contextualization on democracy. And then there's another key issue, which is geostrategic. Because when we started this war, which Obama started it with the support of the whole West, and I'm sorry, yes, there was Bush and then Obama and then Trump. There was the idea that it was the free world versus, let's say, jihadists with their ideology, and evil. It was good versus evil, the war on terror. And in these 20 years, from what we understood, the world is even more complicated now. There's not only a cultural issue on how we conceived democracy, but perhaps there's a different scenario at play of a very much more complicated world. I think there are three key geostrategic issues here. First, the issue of jihad. Like you spoke well about the link between the Taliban, the Muslim Brotherhood, and we need to understand that there's Turkey that supports this ideological interpretation of Islam that they have. It's very strong, but even Turkey is an ally of the EU and of NATO. So this is the first factor. There's a Muslim majority world where, so then you also have China and Pakistan thrown into this equation. So what does this power mean? I had to flee from Pakistan myself because I was intercepted after I'd arrived. I'd arrived almost in secret, and I'd made a major error, which was and I had to immediately flee from the country because the man who helped me had received death threats, and he had to flee as well. And then there's the issue of China. Pakistan is a black hole right now in the world. The US has worked hard, we know this, but Pakistan has always played the Taliban's game. The Taliban have always had a place to hide in Pakistan, and the US hasn't been able to control Pakistan. And then there's China, which perhaps we can talk about China now, but we are we're running against, we're competing with China now. They're trying to destabilize the whole project idea of the free world. Perhaps we're not aware of this yet. You know, there are university lectures, we talk about China. When China, you know, about how China arrives in and builds Africa, the Silk Road, the One Belt Road Initiative, nuclear energy, investments in other countries. All of this spending money which reaches Europe, even Europe and Latin America, and there's China that tries to play its game in this world. To say there's a complex web of geostrategic factors, which isn't only something, you know, it's not only a cultural question. You talk about democracy, but it's this such a complicated world right now. It's so distant from Western democracy. You think about China, about Pakistan, that we need to know that these differences are key. So you talk about modern complexity, which is also a historical complexity, because history tells us everything here. You know, I remember to have read an amazing book called The Return of the King by William Darley, in which he recounts the fall of the British fleet, the most powerful in the world. We talk about kind of 1815 to 1960. The British expeditionary fleet was the British expedition in Afghanistan that went to Afghanistan and was destroyed. You know, 15,000 soldiers went and only one fled from Kabul successfully. And he was there, the only one who managed to recount what had happened. And in that book we see it's almost like reading something about today, jihad, tribes. And that was 200 years ago. You know, Afghanistan isn't called the graveyard of empires for nothing. There was the British, the Soviets, the Americans, and now we see what's going on. And I think this idea can help us looking back. And we need to enter into this complexity. You know, you spoke about, and you said the complexity of the present, the relationship between countries, the world, nations, that you can't really take for granted anymore. They're different than what we think they are. Because even in the middle of this wider Islamic Arab world, there's a huge amount of diversity. So this modern complexity, you could talk about Pakistan and your little adventure here, which makes me remember another book, well, let's say talks about a real tragedy. In our case, it didn't happen. That came out a few years ago, and it was Who Killed Daniel Perler, the Washington Post journalist who was killed brutally. And it talks about this black hole of a country, Pakistan. So what is the challenge we spoke about? We spoke about a new challenge, this new challenge of jihad. So after what happened in Syria and Iraq, the retreat of these dark forces of evil, ISIS, which now seem like they've settled in sub-Saharan Africa, because there's some very horrible things going on down there. And it seemed like it's taken a different weight. They're able to influence the destiny of the world. And now this conflict has kind of taken us back. It's a very impressive thing. How do we live this kind of news, this kind of complexity? So jihad poses another question to us. So I don't think jihadism, I'm not the only one who says this, many other great scholars have said this, like Olivier Rouac, who was a guest here at the meeting, that they are born of modernity. You know, there's lots of books about geopolitics that say that what happened in Afghanistan was in order to keep Iran involved in a conflict that lengthened its road towards nuclear weapons. So, as a Western power, how do they look at their interests? They always look below their feet, what's happening now, instead of into the future. And it's rather off-putting in one sense to imagine that nowadays this great Taliban army, almost the absolute majority of this army were children under 10 years, or they were newborns under American occupation of Afghanistan. They were just born when America invaded first of all. Because if 20 years ago the Americans had invested these trillions of dollars into building schools, especially in tribal areas like that in Pashto. Pashto is the widest ethnic group in Afghanistan, about 38% of the population. The biggest ethnic group. If they would have built schools, the Taliban would have no one to recruit from now. So what happened will live now in the future, this ideology, but the ideology isn't the issue. The ideology has been there since the beginning of Islam. There's been this attempt to kill in the name of God. It's always been there. But when this becomes a reality, when we give it space, the interpretation of religion then can be horrible, can be truly evil. It can become an ideology. But this ideology becomes true when us people give it space, when we give this ideology room to grow. If 20 years ago the Americans would have built schools, nowadays the Taliban would not have found any fighters to wage its war. This is the issue. 20 years ago, Saudi Arabia was at the same point with regards with human rights, women's rights, that Afghanistan was, that the Taliban were in 1994 when they took power in Afghanistan. Well, where is Saudi Arabia now? Has there been a great change in Saudi Arabia? This change wasn't a decision from the monarchy, like that's often been said. It's a natural progression of 200,000 Saudi students who went to study in the West, in the US, in Europe. And these students came back home with their own witnesses, their own experience with their parents, their families, their relatives. And this is what made Saudi Arabia change. And now women can work, they're in public spaces, they can travel alone, they can drive their own cars. This change happens because people give it space. And we're always faced with this choice to give room to evil or to give room for good. The religion itself can be a source of great good or great evil. Any religion, not just Islam. All religions can be poisonous against life, against human life. But they can also be the road that leads to peace and to well-being and to hope for all people. Just two quick things on what you were saying here. And I think we need to really understand jihadism, what you quoted recently, that I think it's a cultural issue that needs to be understood. It's very important to keep it in mind, to understand what this challenge of jihadism is. When I studied about Syria, about the war in Iraq, you could see writing on the wall in German, in English, messages written by foreign fighters who'd arrived from Europe to fight in Syria and Iraq. This cultural question, to understand jihadism, I think it's important. And the second is that of the threat of jihadism. Let's go back to this complexity geostrategically. The Muslim world has an internal debate now that you can probably explain better than I can. There's a lot of work that the Arab Emirates have done that kind of relationships with the Pope, with the wider world. Let's talk about brotherhood, about friendship. The convention, the conference they've just had in Morocco on the citizenship that Islam provides, and I think it's very interesting. Normally we don't really know anything about this. There's a great debate going on, and then there's another geostrategic question right now. There's who uses Islam as a, so Qatar and Turkey use Islam as a political tool, and we need to understand that there are countries which play in favor of jihadism. So just to understand, it's not only a cultural question, but it's also a great geostrategic game. We know what receiving money from Qatar, and we see Turkey. It's still slightly out of Europe. It plays the game it plays, playing both sides. You spoke about complexity, and I think we need to get to the root of this complexity, which is cultural, it's geostrategic. I just wanted to go back quickly to the idea of time you'd brought up earlier. History, the time for growth, the time for both for democracy in Europe, which it took hundreds of years for democracy to become firmly rooted like it is now. I don't think anyone in Italy or in Spain and France dreams of returning to how it was 2 centuries ago. I think we'd like to keep our democracy, to keep living in our this context of freedom, which we can't take for granted, it wasn't given for free and won't be here forever, but we have to kind of fight for every day. Even with regards to the countries you spoke about, like Saudi Arabia, there's always lots of criticism that can be made, but what you spoke about, the 200,000 young Saudis who went to study abroad and who probably brought back with them another way of thinking, and this became a seed in time that has matured, and it's a very important aspect. It's not that from day to day lessons restarted and councils and everything now works perfectly. It's a process that lasts for decades, perhaps even longer, which we need to open with sympathy, with an open mind. Because with regards to certain countries, we often think, oh, there's a horrible human rights record.
Wael, Farouq.
Okay. Since the beginning of the year 9 of the 1900s, 1926 specifically, we've started seeing this religious violence, and it's continued to develop towards evil. Time hasn't helped it. I talk about Islamic countries. They're all modern countries by and large, but there's this. You just think about the scene in Kabul. It showed this. Because those who were left shot, who were trying to leave there, even risking their own lives, they were Muslims. They were Muslims who were fleeing from this evil form of Islam. In all countries with an Islamic majority, they look to the West as a model, but the West doesn't always act as a positive role model. Because as good comes from the West, also does evil stem from there as well. Because for more than 100 years, there's always a Western force which embraces this religious ideology in order to pursue its own political, its own economic interests. And that's what sort of gives it life. So time goes on. And if there's an experience that kind of moves reality, time moves on, and with great powers like Britain first and America now that sustains these movements, change will never come. For as long as this foreign support is there, change will not come. Because how did they get out of Syria and Iraq? Where do these radicals buy weapons from? Who buys oil from these people? All these are important questions which show that there's some power backing them. Some Western power, which largely contributes which greatly contributes to the propagation of this ideology, to sustaining it. Because, like we said 10 years ago, most Muslims, that the populations of Muslim countries went out to the streets to call for freedom, not for the Sharia law. and think about the Arab Spring, they were not pushing for jihad, for Sharia. It was freedom was what they were asking for. But this freedom, even, in these revolutions, even if the Arab Spring ended badly in some time, this revolt is at the heart of the Islamic world, the call for freedom. And so these ideologies will not end with time for as long as there is a Western power that supports them. And it doesn't have to be West anymore now, because there's a lot of nations that have a vested interest in this lasting destabilization, this lasting conflict, and of the fragility of democracy, because structurally democracy is fragile. It's tied to people. People, have their moments. So it will never become, a solid regime. It always needs to be sustained. It needs people to consent to it and be willing to work for it. So we've seen these horrible images, these thousands of people, of children being given to soldiers over barbed wire fences so that they can be led to freedom, even just them. And from here it's been born, like they're often in Europe, this debate on the term of refugees, often a very visceral one. Some are saying we can't define illegal immigrants, those who flee from Afghanistan as illegal immigrants, because it's our fault they're fleeing there. We created that situation. These people are fleeing from countries where they propagate violence, where there's no human rights, and we have a great role to play in this. We have a duty. A lot of people are being saved now, thankfully. I know people who were on the phone day and night trying to convince their own army, their own militaries to go and help people. Just even just giving 4 names so that 4 names could pass through the checkpoint at the airport. Incredible things we've heard this week, and now we still have this great responsibility, because now many Afghanis will fill the lines of people who walk across the Balkans to reach Europe. Apparently there are 20,000 people on the move now across the Balkans, and they'll join this group and will welcome many of them. So what proposal do we have for these people? For this hypothetical million Afghanis who will seek refuge in Europe? So let me talk about what I saw at the border between Greece and Turkey. I lived that drama. Even Afghanis, because there were still Afghanis fleeing back then, they were used by Turkey, by Erdogan, to pressure the EU. There was this unacceptable use of Turkey by the Erdogan in order to get money from Europe. He was using people as a resource. And I remember this because it was a wound for me to see these families used by Erdogan for economic gain. So I think that faced with this crisis, which perhaps is this refugee crisis, we need to have memory, we need to be aware of what's happened in the past, and a criteria on who we are. First thing, memory. We had an enormous debate, a political crisis on the idea of refugees. This crisis wasn't real. This crisis is our own fear, our fear of others. There's 300 million Europeans, and 1 million people isn't a lot given that. I know what I'm saying is it's contentious, but it's the truth. Is that we didn't have a refugee crisis. We didn't have an infinite number pouring in. Just think about what happened with the Iraqis who arrived in Germany. Now they're working. There aren't any issues on that front. And that's the problem of the weakness of the EU. they're waiting for another crisis, but they should be faithful to itself, because these are clearly refugees fleeing from the Taliban regime. So we have a moral obligation, and I don't know what formula it has, but we have a moral obligation, and we would be less human, less European if we don't help these people. You know, there's someone saying that given this, with its fragility and its sense of weakness, Europe's still perhaps the only region in the world where the idea of human rights is so strong. It's debated on, but it's still there. So the question, how do these human rights materialize? I think it's the most complicated question, because the West and Europe has created a void in Afghanistan. And what do we do now? Do we think only about the refugees or about this void? I think this void is the problem. We shouldn't tire ourselves, become tired of filling this void, not like the Americans did with weapons, but with education. All the attention and the organization should be directed towards this country. Certainly there are people who flee to understand that we need to understand what's thinking about what Afghan people are thinking about. Now, if you want to kind of get an idea, go and see Rose's exhibition. What it's like to be sat in front of someone, an armed man who can do with your body whatever he wants. He can ravage your dignity however he likes. And these people need help. But for the sake of future generations, this void needs to be filled. And like when the Pope went to Iraq, he brought together Iraq. It's just the presence of someone who loves you, who means well, that needs to be made concrete in humanitarian missions towards Afghanistan. They're an essential part of the solution. So this is our hour has elapsed of trying to kind of dialogue about certain issues, certain outlooks of the situation, which unsettles us, which leaves us with this sense, like you said, of this great sense of emptiness and of disillusionment. But even the impetus to have a more acute outlook on this complexity and to learn from our defeats, to learn from the crises, from all this great undoing, and to re-earn this sense of rebuilding. So thank you to both of you for taking part, for your outlook, for the interesting things you've said, and I wish you all a good last day of the meeting.